This is 222 North 13th Street, Tekamah, Nebraska. My grandparents bought this house in October of 1954 when they moved back to their hometown from Woodbine, Iowa. My grandmother lived in this house from October of 1954 until 2005. This house is where my career as a writer began. Every year at Christmas time, I spent a couple of weeks here after Christmas. Christmas would be over, and Grandma already had the bed made up because she knew that I was going to stay. Grandma loved the story of the Griffen family. That was probably the most important thing to her in the world, except her God and her church. One December 26th, I got up in the morning, I came down to the dining room, and she went in the back room and she brought out this book. This is my great-great-great-grandfather Jesse Griffen's diary that he kept during the frontier days. And the first words in the diary are, "I was born on the morning of the 13th of April, 1829, in the village of Steeple, Ashton." The reading of those words was the beginning of my life's work in telling this story. That day, after I had written my thank you notes to all the great aunts for Christmas, Grandma sat me down with a piece of paper and a pen at her dining room table and allowed me to copy down the story of my great-great-great-grandfather's life as he wrote it in his diary. And from that day on until this, recording the story of that family has been the passion of my life. This book is to me, bar none, the most precious thing that I possess. This diary was written, as far as I know, this diary was written during the hard winter of 1888. We believe there were more diaries, there was a lot more letters, a lot more documentation from that family, but there were multiple fires and disasters in the Griffen home during the last part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And the reason why we still have as much as we have is just because of the sheer volume of what was there in the first place. So what this represents is a diary he wrote in 1888, which is a remnant of almost a library of what once existed. What I learned in this house from the first time that she showed me this diary was that this is a unique story. It's not just genealogy, regardless of whose relatives they were. This would be a unique story. Jesse and his people have to be able to be a blessing to the rest of the world. We are standing about a half mile from where Adam Bigler's ferry crossing was in 1857, where the Mormon pioneers came across the Missouri River. This is the Florence Mill, one of the few remaining buildings from the original town of Florence, where Jesse and Mary Griffen first came to in 1857. the moment I am standing just behind the Florence Bank. The Florence Bank is another one of the buildings remaining from the time that Jesse and Mary Griffen were here during the late 1850s. The Florence Bank sits across the street from where the Willett House was. At the time, Florence was a tiny little town and there wasn't enough housing for most of the pioneers who had just come here. So, most of the pioneers, when they first arrived, would stay at the Willett House Hotel at the corner of State and Willett. Now, the Florence Bank plays into this story in that in the late summer of 1857, during the panic, the Florence Bank closed and most of the people in the area, including presumably Jesse and Mary Griffen, lost all of their money and ended up having a very difficult winter. This is the Florence Presbyterian Church, one of the first churches in Nebraska. This is not the original building, but the original building sat approximately on this site. On November 19, 1857, after a blizzard, Jesse and Mary Griffen's first child, Melinda, died. They were heartbroken. On August 5th, 1858, Reverend Amos Billingsley of the Florence Presbyterian Church recorded in his diary that Jesse and Mary Griffen came into his church anxious and confused and seeking for answers due to the death of their child. I am standing across the road from the town site of Old Rockport. Rockport could have been said to have been the oldest community in Nebraska, having been started on the site of Manuel Lisa's 1813 trading post, Fort Lisa. The town itself was started in 1857 and was a timber camp. The men and their families who made their livings here harvested the timber and processed it into lumber and shingles. Jesse and Mary Griffen spent the first 10 years of their lives in America in this community. There were also stone quarries nearby that provided rock for foundations for homes for pioneers in the area. In the late 1860s, the Union Pacific Railroad gained control of the natural resources here. The natural resources were stripped from the land. The town failed and most of the people left. And that was when Jesse and Mary Griffen moved to Tacoma. Along this creek, which at the time was called Hawley's Creek, was the little downtown area of Rockport. Along this creek was Hawley's steam sawmill, Russell's steam sawmill, and Charlie Burdick's shingle mill. I do not know exactly where these buildings were, as all remains have been removed by the passage of time, but it was somewhere along this area. This stone quarry is all that remains in evidence from the town of Rockport. Between about 1858 and about 1867, Jesse Griffen and Charlie Burdick worked in this stone quarry. The bluffs originally came much closer to where the road is now, and what you see represents the blasting of the way of the cliffs for stone. Do you realize how much stone they blasted out? That is a huge amount of stone going. From what I understand, those cliffs used to come all the way like to where we're standing. Behind me is one of the few remaining buildings in the town of DeSoto, Nebraska. DeSoto, Nebraska now is almost gone, a shadow of its former self. But during the Civil War, DeSoto was a town of several hundred people. There were 5 churches here, the county courthouse was here, and a main street full of businesses. There was even a newspaper, the DeSoto Pilot. On Saturday nights, everyone in the area from all of the smaller towns, including Rockport, would gather in DeSoto. When I think of DeSoto in the old days, during the Civil War, I picture the sound of horses' hooves, men fighting in the street, the sound of people shopping and talking in the stores. DeSoto was the center of life for everyone in this county, including Jesse and Mary Griffen. One of the places where you could go to in DeSoto was the Kennard Brothers store. The Kennard Brothers store was your typical dry goods store that they sold clothes and groceries and almost anything that you would need. Another place that they would have gone in DeSoto was the DeSoto branch of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Most of the churches at that time actually met upstairs in the courthouse. The circuit rider would come here, say for the Methodist, once a month, and then in the upper floor of the courthouse they would have church. I do not know if the Reorganized Church had their own building here or if they met upstairs in the courthouse, but this was the closest branch of the Mormon movement to Jesse and Mary Griffen at that time. There were about 30 people in that branch according to the records of the Reorganized Church in Independence, Missouri. The Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in DeSoto opened in about 1865. Now the town started to die after Blair was started in 1869, so we're talking about a period of about 5 years here.
Hello, I'm Carol Dash, and I used to be Carol Anderson, and I'm one of the people who is an ancestor or a descendant of the people that lived in this lot in Tekamah, Nebraska. I was born in the 40s, so my experience here was in the 1940s, and my great-grandma and grandpa lived here. They were very important people to me because I lived right next door. And every day I was invited over to my great-grandma's house for weak tea and graham crackers and a lot of piano playing and singing and just being English ladies together.
And tell us, what was your great-grandmother's name?
My great-grandmother was Eva Marie Rice was her married name. Eva Marie Griffen was the name she was born with.
And who were her parents?
Her parents were Jesse and Mary Griffen. I do remember sitting on the front porch. My grandpa was much, much older than my grandma, and he wasn't well a lot of the time. And I think he sat out there in the sun and enjoyed being there, and we were there with him. I remember going across the alley from my house to their house and exploring the cave in the back where we had a storm cave, the old-fashioned kind. But I remember mostly being inside and some of the furniture she had and how she was a gracious lady. And I remember her hugs a lot. she was very active in the Methodist Church and teaching Sunday school, and always very active. And so I remembered Jesus has me, what is this?
Jesus wants me
for a sunbeam. And I'm trying to think what they were. That one I remember a lot. And what are some of
Those
the
old
other ones?
ragtime songs that she used to like.
Oh yeah, she did. She liked to do the oompa stuff with the left hand. And whatever musical talents I inherited, I think I inherited mostly from that side of the family. But even when I was like 5 years old, I could tell when she missed an or a pa. Sometimes it was one, sometimes it was the other, but I just loved to hear her play. I remember a library table that was very pretty, and I think she probably, I can't say that I know for sure, but probably had some nice things on that. I think I inherited a candy dish and some candlestick holders from her. And she also had a secretary, and I know she had some nice things in there, but the things that I remember were an abalone shell and probably maybe one of those glass, kind of decorative glass, kind of, I don't know, like a half moon sitting on it. Doilies for sure, probably a little vase. I have from her some beautiful hand-painted china that had one of the pieces that I have still has the rose, the scented rose petals that were dried that she did. It's kind of crazy all these years later, and the scent is about gone. But I have it at home and think about her and remember what the house smelled like. I know she did some crocheting, because I have a crocheted afghan that she made, and perhaps more things than that. I'm not sure who made it, but I have a beautiful baby blanket that someone made, and I think she might have. And I think she and my mother and her my mother's mother, and then my grandma that we're talking about, made a beautiful quilt that the three of them made together, and I have that. I have so many things from that side of the family, all kinds of beautiful doilies and things that they made, and almost every room in my house has some things in there.
We have a remarkable collection of special things and antiques from that family.
A lot of photos too.
Grandma used to say, "It's amazing." And this is just the way she'd say it. She'd say, "It's amazing. Most people have one or two photos, and we have dozens."
That's true.
The daughter of the people that bought it, or the granddaughter of the people that bought it, she thought it was a cute little house and wanted to restore it at one point, but it was too far gone by that point for her to do anything with it. Just so Terry can speak on here too, one of the things that my mom's brother talked about just before he died was how the kitchen table in here, the top of it was made out of porcelain, and Eva would, since she could wash the crayons off, she'd just let Mom and Terry color right on the kitchen tabletop.
I'll bet the house didn't start till maybe about here. I think maybe clear back here. It was a really small house. There was some kind of an old, it wasn't this shed, there was some kind of an old shed back there, and then, as I said, that storm cave, which was made of brick, and you actually did go downstairs below ground in it. I think probably she did have a pump, but I know the house we lived in had running water.
Which was right next door.
Yeah.
If she'd say, "Oh, don't show that."
Yeah, I know.
She'd say, "Ish."
I'm saying it for her.
Yeah. Well, one time we had a family reunion, and after that house looked like that, and I thought it would be fun in my youthful idealism to have Grandma and Ruth and Jean and everybody stand in front of it, and they didn't like that idea.
No, it's too bad. It looks so awful, because actually behind the house, all the way up to that wall, was our yard, and we had a huge garden.
Yeah.
I don't know, it was at least half of the width of that lot. We had a lot of fun rolling down that hill.
And what had happened was that the winter before, they had suffered through that January 12th blizzard when all the school children were trapped in the schoolhouse. And
Probably 1988. I mean,
yeah.
1888.
And the children in the Crawford school only just barely survived because Mr. Crawford and some of the boys heroically led the kids along the fence line. Immediately after that winter was over, then Jessie bought this place. Then Eva lived here for the rest of her life until she died on November 16th, 1952. During the Depression, when my grandmother and her parents were evicted from their home, Eva took them in and they came and lived in this house with her. So, between Jessie and Mary Griffen and Eva and her daughter, her grandchildren, and my mother, there were 5 generations of that family that knew this house. Way that the dirt is dozed up here, this is probably where the house was. Now see, on this side of the creek, this was where Uncle Alvin lived. And I'll tell you the story about Uncle Alvin. Alvin was a pack rat. He saved every last newspaper that was ever mailed to him until the entire house was filled with newspapers, so that there was a path from the door to the bed, a path from the bed to the stove, and other than that, you couldn't get around in there. Elvin always ate his meals with Uncle Jess and Aunt Em, and Elvin could do farm work, but Uncle Jess had to show him what to do before he could do it. He didn't have the initiative to do it on his own. When the Griffins lost the farm in 1938, and the people that lived on this place became like refugees, Elvin was taken in by his sister Eva in the little house in town, and that's where he died in 1942. Elvin was really good with animals. Little animals, they trusted him for some reason because he was so gentle. And he could tame wild animals and make them for pets. And then his little great nieces and nephews, he would let them pet them and play with them and touch them. The way he was described to me, Elvin was one of the kindest people that they had known. And that's one of the things about the Griffins. You know, my grandmother was never someone to give somebody a break if they lived the way they weren't supposed to or if they weren't quite up to par. But when she was telling me about Eva and Jess and Elvin and all those people, what she said to me was, they were really good people. They were good people, which meant that this family, in her eyes, was uniquely Christian and moral and kind and gentle. See, Jesse Griffen, he was a Mormon. He was a frontier utopian. And what I mean by that is he had beliefs that were similar to the people in the 1830s and 40s who had believed in the idea of nature and harmony and Zion and of a perfect community. First, Jesse came here in 1868, and then shortly thereafter, his brother Simon, also a Mormon, came, and then their brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Eliza and William Warren, came. And so in the 1870s, what you had on this farm was a small community of Mormons living out in these hills, having a little frontier utopian community of their own. What's unique about this farm is that this farm functioned more than a farm. It functioned almost like those communities back east, like the Shakers were, or the Oneidas, or like the Mormons were at Independence. It was a little communitarian society of religious believers. And it's interesting that they named it the Evergreen Home because all these communitarian societies back east would give their communities names based on nature. Pleasant Hill, Fruitlands, and so on and so forth. And so you had these 8 or 10 frontier utopians centered religiously on this farm, which they called the Evergreen Home. I would like to know exactly what the nature of their beliefs were, what made them unique, this particular utopian society, maybe what songs they sang. I would love to find accounts of their worship on Sunday morning together in this beautiful place. What I can tell you is, amongst their beliefs was a belief in conservation, in the sacredness of nature, the sacredness of the trees. Naturally, there would have been trees along the creek here, but there was a whole stand of hardwoods planted by Jesse Griffen after he came here in 1868. And at one time, there was an orchard of 200 apple trees that he planted on this place. And where this all came from, when they lived at Rockport, south of here in the 1860s, they had been right in the middle of an environmental disaster where the Union Pacific raped the trees, raped the land, took the natural resources, and destroyed their town. And so when they came here, Jesse came with the idea that they were going to do differently, that they were going to plant trees, that they were going to be conservationists, that there was something sacred in nature and in preserving nature. Let's go look at the historical sites on the farm, including the trees. This farm was homesteaded by Jesse Griffen, my great-great-great-grandfather, and the main character in the stories that I have written, on March 1st, 1868. This is the evergreen home, Jesse and Mary Griffen's beloved homestead. This was, in a sense, the Zion that Jesse had dreamt of ever since he joined the Mormon Church in 1847. They homesteaded this land March 1st, 1868. When they came here, they had with them their two older sons, Welland and Elvin, and their young daughter, Annie Attila. Annie died just before Christmas, the year after they came. And she was buried upon this place, though we don't know exactly where the grave is. Now, on this farm, there have been at least 4 different houses. The big house, so we are told, sat closer up here on the top of the hill. In the early part of the 20th century, the big house burnt to the ground. So my uncle, Modest Gardapi, told me. Modest was a neighbor of the Griffins at the time of the fire. Jess and Emma, Jesse's son and his wife, they got the piano stuck in the door. And they lost everything trying to get the piano out of the house. One of the things about the Griffin men was they were very gentle, they were very idealistic, and they were very generous. We know that going all the way back to the time of Jesse Griffin himself. His sons, during the Depression, so we're told, couldn't stand to see their neighbors suffering and not being able to take care of their own bills. And so the Griffin men would help their neighbors even when they didn't have enough money to take care of themselves. And finally, they lost the place, unable to pay their mortgage. Yep, I'll bet. You know, it's funny, all my life I've been coming up here and I've never noticed that. I'll bet right up here is where the big house was. Looks like an old Crush bottle back in the 30s. I guess Uncle Jess drank Orange Crush. It could be, that could be fencing from around Uncle Jess's yard. Mary Jane had a house full of small children. She had a husband who was dying of cancer. And Mary Jane, she was a hard worker, but because of the circumstances in her life, she didn't have any education to be able to have a better job. Well, the reason why Uncle Elvin went and lived with Eva at the house in town was because Jess and Emma and Elvin were all of a sudden homeless. Mary Jane had a husband that was dying of cancer and a house full of small children, and then her grandparents were homeless, and so she had to take them in. And so Mary Jane and Eva, between the two of them, were taking care of the whole family. Right over there on the other side of the property line, that's where my great-grandparents, Doyle and Mabel, met each other. Mabel was Jesse Griffin's granddaughter, and Doyle's father farmed on the other side. Doyle and Mabel had a rock-solid marriage. I think they were married for something like close to 60 years when she died. They were good people. Here we are at the north end of the Evergreen home, just across the fence line from the Mason place. Let's take one last walk through. Even more than 150 years later, after he came to the United States, the ideals and dreams of my great-great-great-grandfather, Jesse Griffen, still live in me, still live in the woods on this place. I hope that in reading this book, that those dreams and ideals and beautiful things might live in you also.